In today's special episode, we're talking with the eminent scholar and biographer David S. Reynolds, perhaps the leading authority on the cultural history of the United States in the 19th century, and known to many of us as the author of the landmark biography of John Brown Abolitionist, which today we're saluting in its 20th year since its publication in 2005. I was delighted to speak with Dr. Reynolds the other day, just as he was finishing up his forthcoming work, Two Ships, which will be published by Penguin Press. He's going to share a little bit about Two Ships, and then we're going to go full into John Brown, and we'll be talking about another important biography of Dr. Reynolds as well, his cultural biography of Abraham Lincoln, which was published 5 years ago under the title Abe. I've got a lot of that conversation to share with you, so let's get to it. From New York City, this is Louis A. DeCaro Jr., and this is John Brown Today.
Yeah, I was finishing up a book I'm doing for Penguin. It's called Two Ships, and the subtitle is Jamestown 1619, Plymouth 1620, and the Struggle for the Soul of America. And it kind of begins with the arrival of the slave ship and the Mayflower almost simultaneously, a year apart. But much more than that, it kind of shows how it gathered, almost snowballed over time into this huge cultural conflict, both between the Mayflower and the slave ship. But on top of that, the Puritan versus the Cavalier. And John Brown does come in when I'm discussing the image of the Puritan in the North, the anti-slavery Puritan. So I was finishing that up, and
Oh, that's wonderful. Congratulations. That's going to be another great story. It sounds like it's really important for where we are now, too, sort of trying to find a stable place to stand.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah. It's for a lot of people back then, not now, but back then, there was just a indelible difference between the so-called civilizations of Jamestown and Plymouth. I mean, they were called that, the North versus the South, and the Puritan versus the Cavalier. And it was kind of a hatred in the bones, so to speak, as some people called it, just almost like, MAGA versus the East Coast liberals or what, however you want to describe it. But,
Yeah.
how can that other side even stand, so forth. Yeah, so it speaks to the history of division in America.
Yeah.
That particular division died out really, as I trace it, late with the collapse of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow, where the kind of formerly opposing white people on both sides kind of ganged up against both African Americans and immigrants. And so the whole Jamestown Plymouth thing kind of died out at that point.
Yeah.
But of course, it's reappeared, albeit differently today.
Looking forward to that. That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm so happy to be able to speak with you. I did want to in part begin by celebrating the 20-year anniversary of John Brown Abolitionist. It's been such a game changer, to say the least. Just to express my appreciation, there are three things that I'd like to say about John Brown Abolitionist. First, your John Brown biography has proven, I think, the definitive biography of this generation and probably beyond. I think it's a book for the ages. I hope that it's being read in 100 years, and I think it will be. I think that it strikes a wonderful chord between the substantial biographical work that Villard presented, the substance of that work, but the lyrical and social political imagination of W.B. Du Bois's book, which, as you know, wasn't so great as a hardcore history text, but which the interpretation has lasted. I think what your book did was to bring that together. So I want to say that. I also want to say that your John Brown did more than any historical or cultural measure that I know to challenge the deeply embedded bigotry of the 20th century that had formed against John Brown by putting him in a context of cultural and historical appreciation. I don't know if anyone really did it the way you did it as a blockbuster. And thirdly, your John Brown and Abe biographies, your Abe Lincoln biographies taken together, notwithstanding everything else you've done of such importance, in cultural studies have provided a kind of dialectic that I don't think has been known for generations. That is the John Brown Abraham Lincoln thing has come back, but I think in a much better way with more critical thought, not just a kind of a romance. But your Abe Lincoln, John Brown is very much present, and I want to get to Abe if I can, just a little bit. But John Brown is very much part of your Abe Lincoln story, whereas a lot of, as a lot of Lincoln scholars, not just then but even now, they don't like John Brown, and they're very
Mhm.
hard on him. So more and more and more, your book to me is just aging like fine wine, and I really appreciate it. I want to celebrate it.
Well,
So
thank
yeah,
you. Coming from you, Lewis, that's very meaningful. I think you know probably more about John Brown than anybody else, so I truly appreciate that. Thank you.
well, thank you. That sort of happened by accident, just because I keep digging in the same hole. But so before I have a number of things I want to ask, but let me ask you first of all, would you generally share how you became a cultural historian and what that entailed in terms of you, not just being, working as a historian in general, and then talk about your preparation or, how you approach your themes. I know that's a very general, but I like the background first, if I can.
Yeah, well, I went to graduate school at Berkeley, and my first professor there was an American cultural historian named Henry Nash Smith, and I wrote a paper for him on popular religious novels of the 19th century, and that became my first article, and then led to my dissertation, Faith and Fiction: The Emergence of Religious Literature in America, in which I investigated the emergence of kind of popular religion that later produced bestsellers like Ben-Hur and The Robe and Ten Commandments, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I rooted it in 18th century narratives. And I study about 250 different works in that book. It was published by Harvard Press. But I was sort of interested just in culture, American culture. And then when I went to Rutgers, then I wrote a book on George Lepard, who was almost like a very, very popular writer in his day in the 1840s. And nobody talks about him now, but I wrote a book on him. He was like an American Karl Marx. Very
Mm.
much, he opposed both chattel slavery and also wage slavery and so forth. And then I came up for tenure at Rutgers, and I was teaching Rutgers. They said, "Well, can't you write about major writers?" I said, "Well, sure, of course." Major meaning, Melville, Hawthorne, and whoever, Walt Whitman, Thoreau, Emerson, Dickinson, Poe. So I wrote Beneath the American Renaissance because I noticed in all these popular works that I had written about and very few people had read, there were corresponding themes to what was going on in Moby Dick and Scarlet Letter and Leaves of Grass and everything. I said, so that's when I really kind of tied together culture with sort of elite literature or the canonical literature. And then I said, well, that was kind of fun to do. And that was published by Knopf and also later by Harvard and by Oxford. I mean, it never sold many, it only sold 4,000 copies, but it kind of introduced me to the field. And then I signed up with Knopf for Walt Whitman's America, which kind of does for one figure what I did when Beneath the American Renaissance for several figures. And I really tied Whitman into his contemporary popular culture. With him, it was relatively easy because he had spent 20 years as a journalist. He had actually written in almost every kind of genre: sensational, sentimental, temperance. He had sort of tested out all these genres and then he kind of brings them all together. He was also editor of an anti-slavery journal for a while and so forth. Then he brings all these voices together in Leaves of Grass. So again, a kind of correspondence between the culture and kind of a well-known figure. Then I did other edited books and so forth. And I was talking to my brother-in-law, and he said, "Why don't you write a book on John Brown?" I said, "Yeah, that would be a great idea." because and the reason I was interested in John Brown especially is that for years I had taught Henry David Thoreau's A Plea for Captain John Brown, in which Thoreau says things like John Brown could not be tried by his peers because his peers do not exist. And he said, even if he were lately the vilest murderer, in his case, it's okay. And Thoreau, I said that, that's really weird because Thoreau didn't genuflect to anybody, not even to Emerson, who was his mentor. I said, and he never kind of bowed down to us, and he compared him to Jesus Christ. And
Yes.
I said, where there is such smoke, there must be a little fire going on there. And so then I said, why don't I try to contextualize John Brown the way I contextualized Walt Whitman and some of the other writers and all that stuff. So that led me back to Brown's roots, the fact that his father had lived with in Connecticut in the 1790s with Jeremiah Halleck, who was a New Divinity Calvinist, and who was and Owen Brown, the father of John Brown, overheard the conversation between Halleck and the visiting Samuel Hopkins, who was from Newport,
Mhm.
Rhode Island. But Hopkins had initially been a slaveholder, but he really turned against slavery and he applied the so-called doctrine of benevolence to being in general that had arisen with Edwardian Calvinism, but he applied it to African Americans, and he really turned against slavery, and he wrote quite influential pamphlet. And so Owen Brown overhears the conversation, and then Owen picks up a pamphlet by Jonathan Edwards Jr.,
Yeah.
who himself was a New Divinity preacher, the son of Jonathan Edwards, the great theologian. He was a great theologian, but he also owned Black people. Not many, but he did own Black people. Whereas his son, Jonathan Edwards Jr., turned radically against that and published a pamphlet in 1791 that Owen Brown read. And he said, from that moment, I've been a committed abolitionist. Then
Yeah.
John Brown himself is born in 1800, kind of in this framework of the kind of post New Divinity, anti slavery religious thought. And he even considers training with Moses Halleck, the brother of Jeremiah, for the ministry, but that fell apart. But at
Yes.
age 12, as we all know, he was on a cattle drive for his father, and he goes to a place, a farm, and meets a very engaging and intelligent young African American boy, and plays with him, and is very friendly to him, and just is astounded when the boy is not allowed to eat at the table, and is sent out to the barn or wherever to eat, and also is hit with a shovel. So, and Brown said, from that moment, I've just been a very committed abolitionist, and I was really interested in that, and then how he feeds right into the Underground Railroad in the 1830s and 40s. Never really got too close to Garrison or the abolitionists. I mean, they were wonderfully inspired people, the Garrisonians, but a couple of things about them he didn't like. They were disunionists. They basically said, okay, the South should go its own ugly way, and we should separate from them and let slavery rot off the vine in the South. We're not going to have anything to do with. Brown was never really a disunionist. He believed in the American Union. He believed in the American flag. He just wanted a nation without slavery. So
Yeah.
also, frankly, the Garrisonians were pacifists, and they were come-outers. They were so disgusted, as you know, Lewis. They were so disgusted by the Constitution that Garrison called it a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, and he burned it in public. He
Mm.
burned that and the Declaration of Independence in public. And this kind of action, John Brown didn't like. Now, he did write a provisional constitution for the United States himself, which he wanted to be the constitution for an imagined colony that of mainly African Americans, but also people sympathize with him, perhaps starting in the Appalachian Mountains and spreading elsewhere, in which he puts slavery right up front there in the Constitution and denounces it as an essential evil. Whereas the American Constitution kind of nodded, almost condoned slavery with its clauses about fugitives from labor, they have to be returned, and the Three-Fifths Compromise. So some people to this day interpret it as really a pro-slavery document, and he puts anti-slavery right there at the beginning and continues throughout. And he even rewrote the Declaration of Independence. Kind of a quixotic idea of forming a new nation or new or reframing the American experiment on the basis of equal rights. And nothing, of course, ever really came of it because he never was able to establish this imagined colony and then would-be country or something. But it shows how different he was. He didn't want to destroy the Constitution or destroy the Declaration. He wanted to reframe them in a positively anti-slavery direction.
If I could just interject to say, that's why I think I've heard people say that speak of Brown as a revolutionary, but I think in fact he was really much more of a reformer. He really wanted to make the country as it was live up to its best self.
Yeah, he idolized the founding fathers, even though he recognized that they were of a certain era in which Virginians held people in slavery. But he isolated the Declaration of Independence, which was like Jefferson's best moment when the Declaration, all men are created equal, and he kind of isolated that ideal. So he didn't just simply dismiss the founders or the founding of America or the Constitution. He just wanted to point them in a new direction. He
Yeah.
really saw himself as being quite patriotic.
Yes. Yes. Well, the subtitle, which says so much about the biography, and it's so parsed so wonderfully in the preface, succinctly, but so importantly, that you say Brown did not end slavery, but he killed it. You say that he didn't cause the Civil War, but he sparked it. And you said he didn't bring about civil rights, but he seeded it. And I think that every one of those is just so important to appreciate. And again, what you're doing in that biography, I don't think any biographer has been able to do that. In fact, you say that you're arguing for Brown's, this is a quote, for Brown's achievements in these areas and more, end quote. And so again, you do something that I think amounts to kind of a repairing and a truth-telling endeavor in this biography. It's a monumental framework, and I don't know if you want to address. I want to talk about some of the chapters. Another thing I love is the chapter titles. There's a poetic aspect with all the P's in the chapter titles, but
Yeah, that was it's funny because I started with the party, which is a party for
yeah.
John Brown's memory, and I thought it'd be kind of fun. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous, but anyway, it's just
But it works. It works very
yeah,
well. But I'm
me
wondering
too.
if you could share about this paradigm that you came in as you were thinking about this. I mean, this is a guy who you're disagreeing with these old, lost cause people saying it was for that damn John Brown, we wouldn't have had the war. And you're saying, no, he didn't cause the war, but he did spark it. And all the way down to the civil rights movement, because I find, because I did my work on Malcolm X, and so to go from the 20th century to the 19th century was kind of a step for me. But I'm always thinking about John Brown when I'm thinking about Malcolm X. And I'm always thinking a little bit about Malcolm X when I think about John Brown. You grabbed that and you brought that into the argument, which I think is a wonderful thing.
Every book that I've written, every major book that I've done a lot of kind of minor things as well, but is based on three questions. Where did it come, it being my subject, where did it come from? How did it emerge and become what it was, my subject?
Yeah.
And what impact did it have? So in a way, all of my works can be reduced to those three questions.
Hmm.
in Beneath the American Renaissance, in Walt Whitman's America, John Brown, in Abe. And when it came to the impact, what, I have two basic phases in writing my books. The research phase, which usually takes me about 4 years, 5 years, something like that, if I'm lucky enough to be healthy during those periods. And in which I go to archives. And now, increasingly, there are archives online. There used to be the wonderful Boyd Stutler or John Brown archive, and I traveled to Ohio and to wherever, Connecticut, North Elba, a few other places, various John Brown archives, gathering notes. And Joyce Carol Oates once said, "How do I know what I think until I see what I've written?" And in my case, it's always, how do I know what I think about it, my subject, until I've seen what I've researched, what
Mm.
comes out of my research? So Malcolm X, I mean, his impact came from the archives. Uh, and nowadays it's easy to search, just in quotation, John Brown, and put it through it like a newspaper archive like Redex, which has the complete print run of whatever 44 different 19th century newspapers, and pick out these tons of references to John Brown. And what I found was that, like during the Civil War, he really was a genuine hero among Northern soldiers. They really did love the John Brown song. So did Julia Ward Howe, who turned it into the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Then I learned that during Jim Crow, this is through newspaper and periodical research. This is where I study the impact, impact. The third question, I found that there was real falling off. A lot of people were emphasizing Potawatomi. There was a resurgence around Villard and
That's
Du Bois. And Du Bois holds the first big meeting of the Niagara movement at Harper's Ferry in 1909, which is dedicated to John Brown and Reverdy Ransom, who was actually a pretty militant African American reformer who, in response to lynching, said that African Americans should have dynamite in their houses to ward off potential lynching. And he said that John Brown is like one man who appears in 10,000 years. So here was a black man who was, and he called him the Puritan of Puritans and all of that. Du Bois discountenanced violence, but still wrote a very lyrical and beautiful biography, which got a fairly negative review from Villard. There was kind of a
that's right.
dispute between them because, I mean, Villard's was a much more traditional. It was an appreciative biography, but it's a more traditional biography, whereas Brown's is not per se a biography. It's really as you said earlier, just a passionate lyrical response to him. And it's
Yeah,
still worth reading. I mean, I might teach it, I think, maybe next semester. I think it's a wonderful book. It's a
yeah.
great book. And so I found in my impact phase a lot of Harlem Renaissance people, Langston Hughes and others who were supporting him. And then I find as we approach modern times that yes, he was appreciated by sort of more violent or more militant African Americans and reformers. But at the same time, he was picked up by anti-abortion types like Hurt
That's
and a few other people. And Timothy McVeigh made a hero of him, and Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and everything. And then historians kind of backed off from him a little bit. Stephen Oates in his biography, again, it's a good biography, but it basically characterizes him as fanatical and insane, basically insane, mentally ill, as we would say.
yeah,
And then a lot of modern historians, mainstream, don't like to touch John Brown. Or if they touch him, they just say, okay, he was a factor in creating the Civil War. Yeah, yeah, yeah. He helped get Lincoln elected and so forth. But basically, they don't like to compliment him too much. But he's still pretty much a fringe figure. for a lot of so-called mainstream historians, but there are people like you, myself, I think a growing number of people who are recognizing his contribution. And we don't really have anyone today like John Brown in the sense of someone who would be willing to sacrifice their life for an ideal that people can agree is pretty just, a just ideal.
Yes.
I
Yes.
don't consider bombing, killing 123 people in an Oklahoma building a just idea, or
Yes.
going to an abortion clinic and killing an abortion doctor. But I think most of us would agree that slavery was unjust. And
Yeah.
so, and I don't think the comparisons with Osama bin Laden are correct either. Bin Laden wanted to create a Muslim theocracy. John Brown, even though he's very, very religious, also was very tolerant of people of other religions.
Yes. And I appreciated how you kind of pushed back the memorable year of 2009, which was the sesquicentennial of the Harper's Ferry raid. There was a lot being said in those times. The Yale conference where they did something on John Brown, but the underlying theme was he's very vexing to us. And Tony, the late, he was a wonderful author, Tony Horwitz. I don't want to say I got a chance to know him and appreciate him, but Tony kind of had the same attitude. In fact, I think he sort of created that comparison between a bearded mullah and John Brown. And I think you pushed back at it at times, thankfully, because it
Yeah, I
was
did. Yeah, I spoke out
apples and
against
oranges.
it.
It's not the same.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's not really the same. He was a politician, and the Republican Party, which he represented, it was immediately tarred as the John Brown Party.
That's
Oh,
right.
they're a
Yeah.
bunch of, like today we tar the other person as whatever, a socialist or whatever we want to call it. And they're and Lincoln was called a vulgar partisan of John Brown. So Lincoln, as a politician, distanced himself from John Brown. But by the end of the war, he had a meeting with Frederick Douglass and he said, "Can you please go down and do what John Brown tried to do, which is to spread the news among the enslaved people that there is such a thing as the Emancipation Proclamation and that they are free. Would you please go?" And Frederick Douglass, who initially had been hostile to Lincoln, said, "Yeah, I would love to do that." And he didn't do it because Sherman's march to the sea was going on and the war was kind of approaching a good point for the Union. So he didn't have to do that. But Martin Delany, who was almost like the Malcolm X of
Yeah.
his day, came around to Lincoln's side. He had been very supportive of John Brown, and he thought of himself. He became the highest ranking African American officer in the Civil War, major, and he was ready to go into army. But then Appomattox happened, and he didn't have to go fight. But Lincoln wanted him to do a similar kind of John Brown
Yes.
Underground Railroad thing among enslaved people in the South. So, and then what was her name? I forget. Charlotte Smith, I think her name was, a washerwoman in, I think, Ohio, started a fund. She could only spare $5, but back then, $5 was a fair amount of money. But she said, "I'll contribute $5." That created the Lincoln Monument of 1876, the Charlotte Smith one. It kind of snowballed, and then there was a grand opening. It was really hailed by, at the time, mainly African Americans. Ironically, it's been taken down as being white supremacist. But at the time, African Americans thought it, because it shows a kneeling enslaved person breaking his chains and kind of rising up almost like a sprinter, ready to enter the world. And yeah, Lincoln is there above him, but it's not a condescending thing at all. But the other statue was started by Martin Delany. And again, this was a Lincoln statue, but again, that was supposed to be he idolized John Brown, and his vision would highlight an African woman, not even African American, African woman shedding tears into millions of tears to be contributed by pennies from the millions of formerly enslaved people, each contributing a penny to create this monument. And yes, featuring Lincoln, but also crying for about his martyrdom. Now I'm kind of bending over into the more Abe situation, but it shows you that my kind of research, what happens is that you can't impose today's views on the past. It's so easy to look at John Brown, say, oh yeah, he was a zealot, fanatic, possibly insane. And Thoreau said, oh yes, what a bunch of sane editors, newspaper editors, and senators and representatives. What a bunch of sane people they are.
Yeah.
Passing the Dred Scott decision, which
Mm,
says that black people have no rights that white people have to respect. No rights. So what a bunch of sane people we have right now. You have to go back to the time in which things happened,
yes.
and that's what I try to do in my research.
I think that's important, at the risk of going, getting myself in trouble, but I've also seen, I don't know if you've picked up on it, but in some sections of African American commentary today, maybe popular commentary, but also some academics, there's also a tendency to read kind of the contemporary critique back into John Brown, so that some have called him a paternalist. Some have, I've picked up on some of this, almost a kind of a sideways resentment. And I think it's more about, not wanting white society to elevate John Brown over them, as opposed to really knowing the context, because that wouldn't have been the context of how African Americans were thought of John Brown, who knew him and even after. So it's an important point. And I struggle with the Lincoln thing. Part of me wants to sort of see Lincoln redeemed. Part of me, I have reservations. And yeah, I do want to get to Abe. Maybe we can just jump into it, and then maybe we can go
Sure.
back to Brown. But there were a couple things. Let me start with this quote. You were so kind to give me a few words from my project on Boyd Stutler, and and so I wanted to share something he wrote in letters about Lincoln scholars and Brown. He says, for some reason, most Lincolnians draw their skirts aside when John Brown is mentioned, and he also wrote in another letter, Lincolnians down to this day shy away from the John Brown theme. So that's interesting. Again, that's why I said I appreciate the fact that you did a John Brown biography, a substantial, important work, and then you did Abe. And so you're not drawing your skirts aside. You're embracing him. Not to say that you have to accept everything about him, or not, but that's to be appreciated. Now, on the other hand, you in your biography of Brown, you quote Lerone Bennett. And now this is maybe a little touchy, but we might as well talk about it because Lerone Bennett, you gave this wonderful quote that I actually hadn't seen, where it is John Brown that we must go finally if we want to understand the limitations and possibilities of our situation. He was of no color or race or age. He was pure passion, pure transcendence. He was an elemental force like wind, rain, and fire. Wow, this is a powerful statement. But the same guy writes a biography of Lincoln that I found even in Barnes and Noble, they didn't keep it, at least when I went looking, they didn't even keep it next to the Lincoln books because Bennett was so hard on Lincoln, and he really seems to have done a quite a job on discussing Lincoln's fundamental race. Not that he's an angry racist, but definitely that he's a racist. You argue more for, I think you're mediating Lincoln a little bit more graciously in saying that he wasn't. I think you said it is to Lincoln's credit that he avoided generalizations about race while running for state office in the 50s, 1850s. He sometimes made conservative sounding statements, but you contextualize them. You say they were brief, perfunctory ones intended to appeal to certain groups of Illinoisians whose votes he needed. Actually, he loathed the race baiting that his Democratic opponents utilized to whip up the public. And you conclude, as Lincoln's political speeches of the 1850s reveal, he was far from being the thoroughgoing racist that some claim he was. So How would you advise me to navigate this question going between a Lerone Bennett and going between this understanding of Lincoln? What are your thoughts about that? And especially in this climate, it's very difficult.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, well, Lerone Bennett wrote the book Forced into Glory. Lincoln was not really glorious. He was forced into glory by history, and that he was fundamentally racist. And my point in Abe is that it's true that you can cherry pick quotations from the Lincoln Douglas debate, particularly in one speech in which he said, I never supported black people being on juries or voting or something like that. It was a very brief, perfunctory kind of side thing because he was being forced on the issue. We have to realize that he was debating against Stephen A. Douglas, who Frederick Douglass said has done more harm to black people than anybody. Because Stephen Douglas was very powerful, called the Little Giant. He had a stentorian presence on the scene, and he ran on a completely white supremacist thing. I mean, unblushing. This has to be a white man's government for white men only forever. No hold bar, and he won that election again, the state election.
Yeah.
So Lincoln was in this context, and to win a few votes in Southern Illinois, he kind of said these words, and it kind of passed on to something else. But before that, at Peoria in 1854, he had said, "My ancient faith says that all men are created equal." And he said, black people are men; they're human beings. He didn't say, "I want them to vote or something like that," but black people are people, are men, and Southerners are treating black people like they were animals or hogs or cattle or property or things like that. And then in 1861, when he's going to the White House, he stops in Liberty Hall in Philadelphia and gives a speech there about the Declaration of Independence. And he said, "I would rather be assassinated right here on the spot than sacrifice my belief that all men are created equal."
Mm.
And he got some flack from that, including a couple of journalists who said, "Oh, that's his nigger speech.
Wow.
That's his speech about black people. Oh God."
Yeah.
And what a horrible human being. So even though he doesn't mention blacks specifically in that, same with the Gettysburg Address, he foregrounds all men are created equal in the first line. And negative journalists said, "How dare he insult those who died at Gettysburg by elevating black people to the same level as whites? How dare he? He defied the whole memory of the founding fathers and everything." So he never once mentioned blacks in that speech, and yet, again, impact, reception, context, you see? And then finally, when he witnesses the contributions of the 180,000 African American soldiers, he said, without these black soldiers, I'm not sure we were going to win. And if you've seen the film Glory, I mean, these people were willing to sacrifice their lives, and he said that they were almost like a force, like an engine or something. That without that, I'm not sure we would have pushed it over the top. And he really came to respect them. And also in 1864, he began to really push for, not publicly yet, but in a letter, he said, "We need African Americans to bring the jewel of liberty at the polling booths, by entering the suffrage, by gaining the vote." And then shortly before he dies, he does come out for African American suffrage, the first president to do so, the first president to publicly do so. And then shortly after his assassination, we had the 13th Amendment and the 14th and 15th, which finally by 1870 give black men the vote. So he kind of evolves. It's always there latently, but for a long time he supports colonization. But even there, he was supported by some black militants who presaged Marcus Garvey because they were so disgusted by racism that they were talking about back to Africa. So actually,
Yeah.
Martin Delany supported his colonization movement. ironically enough. But then Lincoln abandons colonization, says, no, 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 no. And then he turns toward an integrationist kind of position where African Americans should have the vote. And his respect for John Brown grows. And then by enemies of Lincoln after the Civil War say, Lincoln's mission was nothing at all except a John Brown raid on the South. They will go down in history as being twins, as being soulmates and brothers. It was a horrible, horrible, terrible John Brown raid on the South, spotted by his enemy. So back then there was this kind of pairing, but then that pairing really fell apart. And nowadays, even historians generally don't make the pairing, or African Americans don't really make that pairing.
Yes, yes. One of the things that I think about is, and I think you see this in the John Brown story in Kansas, as you looked at it very closely, is that John Brown, who was an anti-slavery man, encountered men from the West who were also anti-slavery men, but often they had a very different racial orientation. John Brown, and I don't know whether it's the Eastern abolitionist, or whether it's particularly the Hudson, Northeastern Ohio ideology that he reflects. But there were a lot of people running around. In fact, John Brown writes about it. I think you've seen it in the letters where he kind of says he met people who were Southern people who were anti-slavery, but they didn't want black people in the territory. I just wonder if there isn't that dynamic there of Lincoln being a kind of a Western man who didn't like slavery, but he had to struggle. He had to work through these racial, because he's surrounded. You said context is he's surrounded. He's walking. It's almost like, how do you keep your feet clean if you're walking in a field of manure? I mean, it's very difficult not to have that on you, but it's hard to look at the intentions of the heart. But it does seem that he was reaching for something that his own background didn't give him, that he had to work this out. So I would like to give him that much credit. Also, the fact that at the end of the day, a racist killed him. I mean, he took a bullet. Even if you say he wasn't a John Brown, well, we know he wasn't a John Brown, but it's an interesting thing. That's why I really appreciate that you did your work on Brown, then you did the Lincoln book, because you can have this conversation. The Brand thing, I don't buy. The Brand book. I think you really accomplished a great deal for us in that.
Yeah, John Wilkes Booth was a Southern actor. He is from Maryland, and ironically, he was very, very popular in the North. He was almost like the Brad Pitt of his day and
Yeah,
the handsomest man in America and all that.
yeah.
But when he heard that speech in which Lincoln kind of gestured toward African American suffrage, John Wilkes Booth actually heard it and he said, "That means nigger citizenship." He says, I'm going to really put him through, now I'm going to do it. Now I'm going to do it."
Mm.
And so he gathered his little cadre, and then they tried to
Yeah.
kill a lot of people, and he ended up by killing Lincoln, of course. But yeah,
And in fact, you end chapter 17, Prophet, with that great line. I think it's a killer closing line, pardon the pun, but John Wilkes Booth had lost, John Brown had won.
yeah.
In reflecting off of John Wilkes Booth's letter, which you talk about. So, yeah, I don't want to push the time element, but just very quickly, if I can get your thoughts, I figured out of all the P's, all the chapters, I would extract maybe a handful of P's and just get some thoughts. Because you start with, as you mentioned, the party, and then you do Puritan, all the way down to posterity. Great. So, Puritan, what comes to mind when you think of Puritan? Because you do say, even in the Lincoln book, that the Southerners kind of put Puritans in league with the socialists, and right?
Yeah, well, he was most often compared in his day to the leader of the Puritan Revolution in England against King Charles I, which ended up with the decapitation of King Charles. It overthrew the monarchy, led by Oliver Cromwell. So John Brown was most often compared to Oliver Cromwell as someone who, in the name of overthrowing tyranny, would pick up arms. So disgusted by monarchy or tyranny or hierarchy that they would pick up arms. And also, he owned a laudatory biography, kept it on a shelf near the Bible of Oliver Cromwell by Joel Tyler Headley. John Brown did. And he borrowed Cromwell's motto, "Trust in God, but keep your gunpowder dry," So, yeah, and he was a kind of, as I say, a new divinity Puritan religious figure that emerged out of that whole late 18th century anti-slavery thing, which links back then to earlier anti-slavery Puritans like Samuel Sewall and so forth. So in my new book, Two Ships, I trace the emergence of anti-slavery thought among Puritans. And a lot of times we tend to dismiss Puritans as being just straight-laced prudes and all of that, but there was a radically democratic side to them, the idea being that we're all humans are equal under God. And that was certainly John Brown's point of view. So, anyway,
Thank you. Okay, let's move on. Patriarch.
yeah,
Pa-
patriarch. Well, he had a total, as you know, of 20 children. Only eight of them outlived him. But he was a kind of patriarch of his family. He believed in discipline. But at the same time, he believed in rights for women, for example. He embraced Native Americans. He reached out to people of different races and of both genders. And he was a patriarch, but at the same time, he put his sons on an equality with himself, so that two of them fought by his side at Harper's Ferry. They fought with him in Kansas. So he really loved his family, admired and respected his wife. Well, his first wife passed away, but his second wife. And I think he thought of himself as a patriarch in kind of the Old Testament sense of being devoted to God, but at the same time being devoted to family, but without the enslaved people that some of the old patriarchs had in the Old Testament.
Yes, that's good. That's good. I'm moving along. It's running out of time. Prophet. That chapter, of course, chapter 17 is just it's a gold mine of how you tie in, the literary and cultural impact that he had even when he was alive. So why prophet and how would you frame that?
Well, that gets back to the impact that he had. That, of course, he was hated in the South, but increasingly culturally, he was picked up as an icon in the North. Frederick Douglass in the 1870s said, "My devotion to the cause was like a candle compared to John Brown's burning sun."
Yeah.
He said, and Douglass said, "I could live for the slave. John Brown could die for the slave." And this is Frederick Douglass, there are few people who devoted his life more to enslaved people and Reconstruction, getting, protesting against that than he. And Harriet Tubman respected John Brown so much. So many African Americans respected John Brown. And during the Civil War, then Northern whites picked up on his spirit with a John Brown song, became their favorite marching song. And then he kind of, with the rise of Jim Crow in Potawatomi, his slaying of five people in Potawatomi becomes emphasized. He becomes kind of demonized for having given him his life for Black people. But then people like Reverend E. Johnson and Du Bois and so forth pick up on him, and he's carried forward through the Harlem Renaissance and all of that. And it is true that nonviolence in modern times, and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks have proven more, let's say, effective than violence. But violence has made a kind of cultural impact in its own right in the form of the Black Panthers and Eldridge Cleaver. And I mean, people who supported more militant things, at least maybe shook things up a little bit, even though they, in a sense, departed from John Brown. But in my last pages, I said, frankly, we don't see too much of that today. There's a homogenization of culture, really kind of a loss of the kind of conscience that moral conscience. I'm talking about on the mass level. I'm not talking about the individual level, the mass level, and a kind of flattening, in a sprawling of institutions that in a way snuffs out the possibility of kind of a John Brown type making a big hit or making a big impact. There's kind of a gathering together, for example, of right-wing media and all of that makes it very, very hard for dissenting voices to really make an impact. So
Yes.
he's a prophet, but without too many heirs today that can really have a powerful voice, it seems to me.
Yes. Yes. Well, in some ways, we kind of addressed posterity, which was the last P in the.
Ah, okay, yeah.
Yeah. But to close out, I wonder if you could reflect, you bring this out in your link in Abe, that he did write an autobiography for, I think the person was Fell. Fell. Is that correct? Lincoln's.
Yeah,
And of course, John Brown wrote an autobiographical sketch. I've never read the Fell autobiography. Is it similar in length? And I just wonder your thoughts on John Brown and Lincoln as autobiographers.
yeah. Well, the Fell biography is or autobiography is a little bit of a hagiography, and actually the John Brown autobiography is a little bit hagiographical about himself, to be sure, but at least he's consistent because in his autobiography he traces his anti-slavery feelings to his childhood, and he carries right through to recent times to in his life, basically just saying, I always hated slavery and I did what I had to do to get rid of it, basically. And that's what he told the Virginia court. He said, I had hoped not to fire a weapon even in coming down here. I hoped it to be like in out west where I absconded with some enslaved people. He said without killing anyone. Actually, someone was killed, but violence wasn't really on his mind so much as just freeing the enslaved people and then kind of creating a network of along the Appalachian Mountains, in a way, the way that Al Qaeda did, using mountain hideouts as a way to terrorize the world. When we think about the early 2000s, this very tiny group terrorized the Western world, Al Qaeda, just by kind of hiding. And in a way, that's what John Brown wanted to do. The equivalence is not really there in a moral standpoint because John Brown just wanted to free the enslaved people. Al Qaeda had a completely different thing in mind, but his tactics, and that's what he told Frederick Douglass in 1848, and that's what he was really trying to do. But he stalled, you see, at Harper's Ferry. He didn't get out soon enough. Who knows what would have happened if he had gotten up to the mountains and so forth. But
Now, there's a quote that I've been able to put into writing a couple of times by Congressman Bottler, who was interviewed. It was from Virginia later on, and he did say that. He said if John Brown had gotten into the mountains, there's no telling how far he could have gone because there were people to follow him. So it's an
yeah,
interesting thing that that's not often, the commentary that's handed down to us, that it was a failure before, it was, doomed to fail and so forth.
well, you never know. And he had been a surveyor, John Brown. He knew the Appalachians very well. The Appalachians extend all the way from the north into the deep south. He knew the terrain very. I mean, his idea was to send the message to enslaved people on southern plantations to flee to the mountains to join his ever-growing colony of people there, and that they could use the terrain, the cragged terrain, to evade pursuers and everything. We just don't know. Here's the great Western world of America and all of that, and a few people hiding out in the mountains managed to terrorize America for a number of years, under Bin Laden. So you just never know what could have happened.
You think we'll ever have a John Brown statue that's not on the margins of the country geographically?
No, I
But
really doubt it. Well, not in the current atmosphere. No, 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 no. I
yes,
mean, with even much more less radical people being fired left and right and so forth. Not in the
yeah,
current thing, and even among historians, he's not respected enough. I'm talking about mainstream historians.
yes.
So I don't foresee that, but I hope that my book does whatever makes people think a little bit and wakes people up. And my Abe book as well. And I certainly appreciate your work, your
Thank
own
you.
books, and your contributions. They're amazing.
Thank you. Well, we keep pushing at it. I just say, Douglas said about John Brown when he raised his arms, the sky was cleared. I'll say when David Reynolds published John Brown, he opened the windows and the air was cleared because he let in a lot of fresh air.
This has just been great. And once again, I encourage readers to read my John Brown and also your books and your blog and your website is really keeps John Brown alive for today. So we appreciate that.
Go. Thank you, sir.
Okay,
It's so great to talk with you. Thanks so
thank
much.
you. Thank you
Have a
very
good
much.